Brian Barcelona was 18 years old when he returned to his high school campus, where he'd spent years as a self-proclaimed atheist. That visit was the start of a movement that's sweeping across our nation's public schools.
Many students at public schools face drugs, alcohol, and gangs on a daily basis. But what if these schools were no longer a place of turmoil? What if they were a place for the church to shine bright and bring healing to families? What if we could change our nation's cities from within our public schools? Brian Barcelona believes those what-ifs are possible. In his new book, The Jesus Club, Brian recounts how his raw passion and obedience to return to his high school campus after a directive from God has helped teens from every background experience healing from suicidal thought, trauma from physical and sexual abuse, drug addiction, identity crisis, and more. Brian believes that if we are willing, we too can be a part of this revival that is transforming a generation.
Please welcome to the 700 Club, Brian Barcelona. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's go back a little bit in your life. Your parents divorced when you were a young boy,
Yeah.
and that kind of wounded your heart and left some bitterness there. What happened, and how did you get to this atheist mode that you were in?
So my parents growing up they went to church, and so when everything happened with their marriage, I just came to a place where I was like, man, there's no way God can be real. I mean, how could he be real when we're going through all this stuff at home? You know, my parents are separating, and it really, again, just didn't grow up in the healthiest home, even though my parents did what they could. They were young. Mm-hmm. My mom was 15 when she got pregnant with me.
Wow.
So they were young, young parents. And by the time I was 16, I just came to the conclusion there is no way there's a God.
Yeah. So how did God get a hold of Brian Barcelona's heart?
Well, I always like to honor and thank my grandma who prayed for years.
Amen,
for
brother,
me.
I like that.
Yeah, so she would take my hands, anoint them with oil when I was a kid. And, by the time I got older, I was like, stop putting oil on me, like she put it on my clothes and on the door frames. And, but, when I was 16, I got invited to a church. This guy in my city, his name was Albert. He said, why don't you come to youth group with me? And I told him I didn't want to go. And eventually he got me to go because he said he'd buy me a smoothie. So I said, free smoothie, I'm there. So I showed up at the church. I walked in the doors and I sat in the back and I seen all these kids worshiping in the front. Yeah. And I thought to myself, I figured it out. All of these kids are on drugs. Like, there's no way there's no way you're that happy. You're jumping, you're crazy. And in the back of this room, I started remembering everything my grandma had told me about Jesus. And in the back of this room, I looked up, at the ceiling. I always joke around. I'm like, I felt that's where God lived, maybe. And I was like, God, I don't know if you exist. I don't know if you're real, but if you are, I dare you to touch me. And God touched me that night. I began to weep. Wow. They brought me to the altar. I accepted Christ. I went home. I threw everything in my room away that I felt would offend God. It was like this literal heart transformation. And that is eventually what led me into speaking in schools.
Yeah, let's talk about that because I'm reading your book, The Jesus Club, which I'll tell you all more about in a little bit, but you are fearless about that. I'm not going to say, I'm nervous with you as I'm reading your book going, what is he going to do when he gets in there? But you went back to high school, which is a tough stage in kids' lives. But part of it was just saying yes and showing up and being relational, right?
Yeah. I think there's, high school for some is a traumatic years, and for some it's great years. For me, what I remember the most was in high school, no one reached out to me in my school. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, man, kids are here for 35 hours plus a week, 4 years of their formative years, they're spent here, and, legally they have to be there. Yeah. It's almost like God's divine plan to captivate a captivated audience. The only thing they don't teach is the gospel. Yeah. So when we went in, it was just taking a risk. Taking a risk,
and some schools have Jesus clubs, and so you're able to go in with a place to go to in it. What do you tell kids that's so gripping their hearts? What are you saying to them?
Well, back then, before we didn't have any funding, no pizza, we didn't have anything. So we literally go up to kids and be like, hey, we're meeting in this room. Do you believe in God? And they would say, no. I said, well, come and I'll make you a deal. If God doesn't touch you, he don't exist. And so I always felt like if I put God on the spot, he'll respond. Yeah. And every single time God responded. And now, over the years, there's been a reputation we've been able to get of kids coming and encountering God. It's no longer, we'll still say things like that, but it's really cool now providing a family and a place that they're able to come. And a lot of kids have gotten saved have come in because they don't have food at home. So they'll come in and they'll eat in the gym. We've had coaches that have said, thank you for feeding our kids. It's the only meal they'll get today.
Wow.
So, yeah.
So what are you seeing happen in kids' lives? I mean, you go, you share, really what you're doing is just sharing the gospel message that Jesus is real and wants to change lives. And what are you seeing happen?
One of the most recent stories that I'll share is a young man got reached in a school in South Central last year, grew up in a crazy home, a crazy story of abuse that he went through, came into a club, there was free food, ended up getting radically encountered. And towards the end of the year, I said, why don't you come and roll with us? We'll disciple you. We'll train you, man, and everything we can. And so he came, got discipled. He's been getting discipled in the summer. And just yesterday, literally yesterday, they held their first club of the year there in this school in South Central. And they were telling me that he brought in over 60 students from that school because they've seen the transformation in his life. Even one of the teachers texted me and she said, the coach said, he looks different. Like, what is up with him?
And that's happened to you at a number of the schools you've gone into where the school administration has called you in and said, keep going, keep doing it, because these are tough places you're going into.
Yeah.
What vision has God given you for this, Brian?
I really believe that there's, you talk about the Jesus movement and the student volunteer missions movement. And to me, those are two unique things. Jesus movement was everyone encountering Jesus, getting saved, here in America. And the student volunteer missions movement was about going to the nations. And I really believe that what God's doing in high schools is an embodiment of both. It's a new, fresh Jesus movement of kids getting saved, but not just getting saved, but it's what they're getting saved to. I really believe that in the next years to come, the mission field will be fueled by high school kids that are graduated and go into the nations.
I agree with you. I want to mention, though, at one point in the book, you talk about kind of coming to a place before the Lord of understanding that God had a price He wanted you to pay for this. Talk about that.
Yeah, man, looking back over these years, high school's youth was never a passion of mine. But God asked me to do it. And I feel like too many times in today's culture, we ask people, what do you feel called to? Instead of saying, what is God calling you to?
Yes.
And, obedience will bring about joy, but joy doesn't necessarily bring about obedience. And I think the price of going through all that I went through, from having nothing and no money and people misunderstanding what was going on to where it's grown now, I'm encouraged that it's just one part of the story.
I'm encouraged for you. It's an amazing vision, and it's going to happen. Brian's book is called The Jesus Club. It's available wherever books are sold. Read it, because there's something happening in the lives of kids in our country. You need to know it, and you need to be a part of it. And if you're not, you need to pray for it. You can hear more about Brian in our social exclusive interview on Facebook. To watch that, log on to facebook.com/700club.